Welcome to Watchman on the Wall, a daily outreach of Southwest Radio Ministries and SWRC.com. God is still on the throne, and prayer changes things. We begin this week examining the current state of persecution around the world. Later this week, author Michael Youssef will help us stand strong during these troubled times. Our redesigned website, SWRC.com, now has over 1,000 items designed to educate and encourage you in your walk with Jesus. Books and DVDs at SWRC.com. Your favorite authors and teachers helping bring clarity to the chaos. Brand new resources from Greg Patton, Lonnie Shipman, and Derek Gilbert are available at SWRC.com. When you purchase a resource from Watchman on the Wall, you're supporting the ministry and outreach. So thank you, friends, for visiting SWRC.com and showing your support for Southwest Radio Ministries and Watchman on the Wall. Persecution of Christians is taking place around the world. Pastor Larry Spargimino has the latest details on what is happening to believers across the globe with today's guest, Jeff King.
International Christian Concern, ICC, has served the global persecuted church since 1995. Earlier this year, ICC released the highly anticipated 2025 Global Persecution Index. Jeff King, who is president of ICC, is with us. Jeff is one of the world's leading experts on religious persecution. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us.
Larry, it is an honor to be with you.
We are interested in learning more. I know you're on top of everything, so tell us, how did ICC gather all the information from the past year and organize it for readers to better comprehend the details?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So, we've been at this for 30 years, and so we have staff all over the world. And so we're writing news on a daily basis, and we're getting reports in. We have indigenous staff around the world. But then we're also scouring the news around the world, and that's kind of the building blocks. And then that filters up. We're writing different reports during the year. We testify different things. And then at the end of the year, we assemble it all and into a report because, we work on Capitol Hill, the U.S. Capitol with legislature. And so persecution is complex. So this thing is kind of a primer on persecution. We do it for journalists as well as the interested parties in the churches where they want to really know about persecution. So there it is.
Tell us how you and ICC help the persecuted church. Maybe I know you mentioned you have people all over the world, but what are some of the things that you actually do?
Yeah, the way I describe it is we bandage, we build, and we broadcast. Let me break those down. So with bandaging, we are constantly repairing things, and that means, as you can imagine, a whole lot of bodies. But it's also buildings, and it's careers or jobs. So all these things are destroyed with persecution, and we bandage and repair. But we also build. We want to build the church on the fringe, on the front lines in the war between the two kingdoms. And that's where missionaries, for the most part, aren't effective. It's too tough, it's too dangerous, and they have to keep their head down too low. So we work, again, with the indigenous church. We're pushing out the gospel. So that can mean anything from broadcasting into North Korea to supporting church planners, and then the broadcasting. And that means we broadcast the message of persecution. We do that to the media, mostly Christian, but secular too. I'm on Fox News and all kinds of things. But then we're also broadcasting to the government. We're letting them know what's going on, and we're informing them so they can push back on countries that persecute.
So you are in Washington, and I guess, what about our country now under the Trump administration? Do we have some real concern as a nation for the persecuted church or just for religious liberty around the world?
And are you saying as far as the Trump administration goes?
Yeah, our government.
Yeah.
Are we?
Okay.
Yeah. Does our government pressure, for example, I remember when President Trump was president previous, he put some pressure on Turkey. And I forget the missionary who was there, but they didn't want to let him go. But I think Trump threatened them that he was going to withhold $90 million. And they said, okay, here he is. So, anything like that.
Yeah. He said, I have a deal you can't refuse. It's so good you can't refuse it. So and they coughed him up. Yeah, so the Trump administration 1 just had a religious freedom dream team from the vice president down to the head of the State Department down to a long-term ex-senator and Washington insider running parts of the State Department that are tasked with dealing with religious freedom around the world. And so, I kept wondering, as it looked more probable that Trump would be elected, I was like, can we?
Right.
And a lot of people were asking, is that going to be, what are we going to see in the second round? So I don't know. So Senator Rubio, we've worked closely with for years. Fantastic guy, just love him to death, cares deeply about persecution. So he is a fantastic pick. But at the same time, there's not as many Christians in the administration this time around. And so it's kind of a different deal. But, he's going to be huge, minimum. He's going to be a huge improvement over the previous administration, which just couldn't care.
Right. Where there's no religious liberty, I think those are nations that we have to be concerned about. They can be dangerous to us. And I think where there is religious liberty, and especially where people allow Christianity to grow, they're kind of like, reasonable. They're not terrorists, and they don't want to kill everybody. So I think, nationally, I think if we help these other countries and put some pressure sometimes on the government, not a military threat, but to just encourage religious liberty, I think that America really benefits and the whole free world really benefits.
Gosh, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that was well said. Religious freedom it was enshrined by the founders because it is just the queen of the rights and freedoms that we can possess, that we can own. And you think about it, Larry, it's like, with religion, this means it deals with freedom of thought, of speech, of conscience, of assembly, on and on and on. And so our founders were so wise, and considering our roots, they enshrined it in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. We see, just as you said, around the world where countries embrace that, and they say, you know what, we just need to let people do and be, and let them be as they are.
Right.
That's where freedom rises. That's where economic opportunity thrives. So it's got all kinds of benefits that go with it. It's not always comfortable for highly authoritarian regimes or dictators. They don't want to do that because they need to control everything to stay in power. But it is a tonic for freedom and economic growth.
I'm glad we got into that because sometimes people say, well, how does it affect me? Well, like you point out, if this idea of tolerance, religious liberty, love, concern for one another, not bossing everybody around, just letting people follow their hearts and their consciences, that kind of thing, I think that'll be a healthy relationship. On the other hand, where that's absent, for example, like in North Korea, Kim Jong-un is he's got nuclear weapons, he's got missiles and everything. That's the kind of guy we really need to watch out for. But other countries that are open, we can even send tourists there. I think they like that because they like American money.
They do indeed. And, we spread a lot of it around for the reason that we buy, we're buying influence. It's really, sanction. It's really bribery on a certain level, but it just means that, we provide money, and those leaders in the countries, they take it and they buy college educations in the West for their kids. They buy huge villas, etc.
Right.
That means when we pick up the phone, they'll listen.
Well, our guest is Jeff King. He's the president of International Christian Concern. And, of course, Southwest Radio Ministries has always supported overseas missions, and we are familiar with Christian persecution. We have a concern for the persecuted church. And I'm sure most of our listeners know that we support a Christian school in Pakistan. Pray for Pastor Victor and the school. We thank those who have helped us with this important ministry. And if you would like to be involved in the work of Grace Charity School, send me an email, larry@swrc.com. I'll give you all the information that you would need. Jeff, what are the global trends in persecution, like authoritarianism, religious nationalism, terrorism, displacement? What are some of the things that we see happening in our world against Christians everywhere?
Yeah, I think I'd start, Larry, with the Middle East continues to be emptied of Christians. It's unbelievable what's happened. It started with Iraq, 2 wars, and the Christians were left out in the cold. A lot of times the Christians in the Middle East have connections around the world, and so a lot of them can get out, and they have. It's probably 10% of the population of 20 years ago. And that happened in Iraq, Syria, which used to be a safe place for Christians.
Right.
Syria used to be a safe place for Christians, run by a horrible dictator, but he allowed the Christians to exist and not be harmed by the radicals. That's now gone.
Yes.
And then, so again, just emptied of Christians. It just goes on and on. And as a student of prophecy, I have to wonder, when you look forward, God is sovereign, and when you see all these believers that are being pushed out, there's probably a reason for it. And if you look in Scripture on what's coming, it kind of makes sense.
Yes.
So that's one. And the other one I would say is just the massive geographic growth of Islamic control. We just had a country, I just mentioned, Syria. That's been taken over by the new government. Is really nothing more than ISIS and Al-Qaeda joined together and rebranded. They were fighting for years, and they said, let's rebrand and put a nice face on what we do to the world. But that's an example. And then, Larry, there is a whole swath of Africa, from all the way near the top of Africa, from all the way from the west over to the east. There's a huge area that's just been taken over by radical Islam, and it's a lawless land across countries. It's tied into another issue. They've really taken over there. And there's a certain tribe that's really the key actor, and those are the Fulanis. And the Fulanis, a few people will know, those are the guys in Nigeria that have killed over probably about 100,000 Christians in the last 20 years.
Yes.
They've stolen 3.5 million Christian farms. This group, they used to have a caliphate in Africa, and they want to see that birthed again. They are radical, and they are controlling military and the police in Nigeria. So the massive killing of Christians goes on, and nothing's ever done.
I have been serving in a mostly Chinese church here in Oklahoma, and I know something about the pressure in China, especially with all of the surveillance technology that they have now. I mean, Mao was bad, but he had nothing.
Yeah.
They can listen through walls. They're following people. If you get a low social credit score, you can't travel to see relatives in America, so on and so forth. And I've often thought, President Xi, I think he feels threatened by Christianity. I mean, gentle Jesus, come on now, what is he going to do? But it seems that he needs to be the ultimate authority. And the more I think about it, all of these dictators, even Caesar, if you said, well, I'll go along with these pagan gods, and I'll also have my Christian God, that's okay. But Caesar wanted total allegiance, and I think Xi and all of the dictators, now that I think about it, they feel that their position of power and authority is threatened by Christianity, and I think it is, but it doesn't destroy the country. I think where there's freedom, where there's free market, where people are happy, where people can worship freely, I think the country really benefits.
No, it absolutely does. But these dictators or these Marxist systems or Islamic systems almost, but much more the Marxists and just general, look at Putin as a dictator. These guys, the only way they can survive is to hold and twist the press. And then what they do to the church, they're doing to everybody who's a potential threat to them in the government. And so they'll clean out the judges, they'll clean out their political rivals, clean out the military, everything, and they just kill them one by one or put them in prison. And Christianity is not really a threat to them, but they fear any group, and they don't want to see any group grow too large or have too much power or influence. The only way they stay in power is by the blade or the bullet or the noose. And so they will attack anything, and they're hyper-vigilant and hyper-paranoid, and they will attack and kill anything they see as a threat, and they see threats everywhere.
Right. Well, Jeff, where can our listeners access ICC's 2025 Global Persecution Index? Is that on the Internet?
It is. It's persecution.org, and I think it's /GPI, but they could go to persecution.org and go up to the top and look at reports, and they'll find it in there.
Wow, that's such a a wonderful tool, I think. I'm looking here now, persecution.org/GPI, all in caps. And you can find out what's going on in many countries. You can pray for people. Maybe there's some way that you want to help. And so once again, it's persecution.org/GPI, all caps. Jeff, what about Russia and the Ukraine? I understand Russia has destroyed hundreds of religious heritage sites in Ukraine. And I think they're really persecuting evangelicals. I think the Russian Orthodox Church is the only one that's legit or tolerated. Is that true? What's the situation there as far as persecution of religious groups?
Yeah, what an interesting question and topic. Putin and the Russians. So first of all, the Russian Orthodox Church has worked hand in glove with KGB for decades and decades.
Wow.
Very few real religious leaders in there. These are political operatives, and they see any other Orthodox church or evangelicals as a threat. And then there's just war on top of it. But they've definitely gone after Ukrainian Orthodox. They've gone after evangelicals. I've interviewed these guys. Some have been murdered. A whole bunch of churches shut down, destroyed. Yeah, they're absolutely doing the work of steal, kill, and destroy, which is what their master does.
So horrible. And I think, in Central America, how about Daniel Ortega's regime in Nicaragua? From what I hear, he persecutes Catholic communities, other things of the sort. I don't think he's too friendly with evangelicals. And how about Cuba? Tell us about Nicaragua and Cuba.
Well, Cuba, real quickly, one of my favorite places in the world in terms of the church. Cuba and the China, just shining, vibrant churches. Oh my gosh, I could go on and on. But Cuba is, it's a hellhole, to use a biblical word. It's just a terrible, terrible place. The government has destroyed everything. The people are without hope. Mr. Ortega in Nicaragua, this is a fascinating story. So the Catholics tend to be more political. They were very active in Nicaragua for a long time, and they suffered a lot of persecution for it. And at a certain point, the government, Ortega and the Marxists there, they said, hey, what about these evangelicals? So they don't seem to get political, and they do a lot of good works for people. Let's give it to them, and we'll hurt our enemies, the Catholic Church. Well, so they kind of took the lid off. They took the shackles off. They said, yeah, you guys are free to go ahead. Just do whatever you want. And so pretty soon they were having massive rallies and revivals, including the capital city, with 300,000 people. Well, let's go back to our earlier conversations about how dictators survive and how paranoid they are and their wiring. They're extreme narcissists, and they just kill off anything they perceive as a threat, and they perceive many things as a threat. So guess what happened? They locked up the evangelicals, they arrested them, shut down the churches, and we were involved in taking care of those families, as a lot of groups were, and helped them get to the United States. So anyways, pressure was applied, beautiful, amazing political campaign, and a lot of pressure was applied, and Nicaragua let them go. So, but it's quite a story.
Right. Well, as we come to the end of our interview, what can people do in response to the horrific religious persecution worldwide, and how can we advocate for victims impacted by it? I mean, all of this seems so far away and so remote. Here I am in Oklahoma or whatever, but what can our listeners do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say, hey, look, if you're interested, go to persecution.org or one of the other great persecution ministries and help. But the thing I'd say, look, most people are going to listen and then they're going to be on with life to something else. And I want to tell something to people that's in their self-interest, and that is to follow the persecuted church. I know, Larry, they've hit you, they've hit your heart.
Right.
You're just so normal, just like me. When you get exposed to the persecuted, what you're seeing is deep Christianity. It's biblical Christianity that was being lived out in the book of Acts. And that creates a vibrant, deep church, and we're not exposed to it typically in the United States.
Yes.
So it is in your self-interest, Christian, to follow the persecuted. They're going to change your faith. They're going to radically transform your faith and take you to a depth you couldn't get to on your own.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. May God continue to bless you in the work of ICC. You certainly got a lot of work out there, and And I know we need to pray for you guys. We need to pray for Christians everywhere. In some places, it's very, very tough. So thank you so much.
Larry, so appreciated. Honor to be with you.
There have been a number of Bible commentators who have come up with elaborate ideas, allegedly proving that Ezekiel's temple, described in chapters 40 through 48 of his book, is not a real temple. They claim these chapters are an allegorical description of something else, whatever that may be. The language of these chapters provides a great amount of specific details regarding this temple. It is like an architect's blueprint. If it is not speaking about a literal structure, why the details? It is important to remember that Ezekiel was a Jewish priest living during the years of the Babylonian captivity. The existence of Solomon's temple was, for the Jews of old, proof that God was on their side. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, therefore, was more than the destruction of a building, it was a theological crisis. The promise of a literal temple was proof that God will forgive their sin and cleanse them of all iniquity. It was a convincing sign to Israel that God was still faithful to his covenant. All the wonderful millennial promises would be literally fulfilled, and the presence of a literal temple was the most wonderful promise of all for the people of God. If it were not a literal temple, it would be like inviting a starving man to a turkey dinner only to find nothing more than a pile of feathers. In the words of Dr. Charles Dyer, and I quote him, "The climax of Israel's restoration as a nation will come when God's glory re-enters the new temple in Jerusalem. The new temple will become the visible reminder of Israel's relationship with God. Since God gave detailed instructions for building the tabernacle to accompany his inauguration of the Mosaic covenant, and you can find that in Exodus chapters 25 through 40, it is not unusual that he would also supply detailed plans for his new center of worship to accompany the implementation of the new covenant. This temple will be the focal point for the visible manifestation of Israel's new relationship with her God. Why then do so many commentators argue that Ezekiel's temple is not a literal temple? The answer: because of the animal sacrifices. People argue and say, we don't need animal sacrifices because of Jesus Christ. He has made a perfect, once-and-for-all sacrifice for sin. No additional sacrifices are needed. The sacrificial system has been surpassed. Therefore, we are not to take Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48 literally. That's what they say. Now, that is a common argument. Why do we need priests? Why do we need sacrifices? All valid questions. But let's focus our thinking. Let's think this thing carefully, and let's think it through. First of all, animal sacrifices never took away sin. Only the sacrifice of the Son of God could do that, as explained in Hebrews 10, 1 through 4, and verse 10. The animal sacrifices were acts of obedience to God and showed submission to the divinely revealed idea of the shedding of blood for the remission of sin. Secondly, even after the resurrection of Christ, Jewish believers in Christ still took part in temple worship. Check that out in Acts 2:46, 3:1, and 5:2. They even took part in the offering of sacrifices according to Acts 21:26. They saw these sacrifices as looking back to the sacrifice of Christ, even as is true in the Lord's Supper. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he come. 1 Corinthians 11:26. The sacrifices of the Old Testament had no real efficacy, but they gave worshipers an opportunity to respond to God with humble obedience, and that's what God wants. According to Dr. Dwight Pentecost in his classic work on Bible prophecy, Things to Come, pages 521 and 522, several of the items that were in Solomon's temple are missing or modified in the millennial temple. There is no Ark of the Covenant, no pot of manna, no rod of Aaron that budded, no tables of the law, no cherubim, no mercy seat. The waters will transform the whole region. so that along the banks of the river will grow fruit-bearing trees producing food and leaves that will have medicinal properties. Yet the marshy areas will not be healed, that is, they will not become fresh water, showing that the kingdom age will not be perfect in every way, but the last age in time, with the curse of sin lifted, but not yet removed completely. Seeing Ezekiel's temple as a literal temple is especially difficult for Christians who are Reformed, and this is true for two reasons. First, many Reformed Christians hold to replacement theology and see the church as having inherited all of Israel's blessings. The idea of a future Jewish temple in the land of Israel just is not compatible with replacement theology. When theology controls exegesis, you have a real problem. Secondly, Reformed Christians do not believe in a literal millennial temple because of the concept of a one covenant of grace, embracing redemptive history from the fall to the consummation. There is no room in this one covenant of grace for different administrations of God's kingdom agenda. For dispensationalists, however, the idea that following the rapture of the church another dispensational period would follow is not at all that unusual. To summarize, there are very good reasons to believe that the temple described by the prophet Ezekiel in chapters 40 through 48 of his book is a literal temple in every way. All attempts to make Ezekiel's temple refer to the church, to the heavenly state, or some other reference are fraught with difficulties and violate the plain meaning of Scripture.
What does the future hold? Will faithful Christians face persecution? And how can I be sure to stand strong during these troubled times? Discover the answers to these questions in Michael Youssef's brand new book, God's Final Call. Renowned Bible teacher and prophecy expert Dr. Michael Youssef believes 21st century Christians are experiencing a similar wave of hostility in our culture. That's why the words of Jesus in Revelation can be especially compelling to modern readers. It's a source of comfort and encouragement for those who are determined to be faithful, but also a stern warning of coming judgment for those who seek to compromise. God has given a final call to us. Will we listen? Open the book of Revelation with Michael Youssef as your guide and see your current and future life all at once. God's Final Call. Order your copy today by visiting our website, swrc.com, or by calling 1-800-652-1144. That's 1-800-652-1144. Tomorrow, Michael Youssef will be here to discuss how the book of Revelation pulls back the veil on current events and our ultimate future. Be sure to tune in by downloading our free SWRC mobile app or by subscribing to our daily Watchman on the Wall podcast. Watchman on the Wall is a production of Southwest Radio Ministries and is supported by faithful listeners like you. To learn more, visit swrc.com.